there. I was there twice meeting with refuseniks, and it was cold.
So that maybe at the end you can tell us a little bit about that, because that's where I'm going to finish up today as well.
Okay, good.
All right, so we're going to get started. So again, the lessons from this point on, I will tell you my materials are a little bit shorter because there's the opportunity for more conversation. This is, again, much more in our comfort zone. We're no longer reading about things our great-grandparents experienced. For many of us, this is what we experience. And so it's more, in a sense, as I describe this period, it's more sociology than it is history. All right, so there was a move from downtown to the country. It quickly becomes a migration. Jews spread out geographically all over the country as well, primarily from the East Coast. You start to see the footholds in the Sun Belt, in California, in Florida, Arizona, and here in Texas. Communities really start to grow and develop. What you have as well, anybody who grew up in New York, you know from Levittown, the idea of a mass-produced suburb originates with William Levitt, and the first Levittown is on New York's Long Island. People started to live there in 1947 is where it opens. I mean, I just grew up, I thought Levittown was just a name like anything else. You go to Houston. It's part of life. You don't think twice about it. All right. The return, but what made this significant is returning soldiers from the war. Now think again, it's 1947 where Levittown opens. All right, starting up their own families, take advantage of generous government-assisted mortgages to reestablish themselves in these new housing subdivisions that are sprouting out all over in the suburban world. They're drawn by the promise of a safe streets, of better schools, and the sense of an image of an idealized lifestyle for an American family. You know, every time I think of this, I think of Irma Bombeck. I don't know if you've ever read Irma Bombeck's readings. They're quite humorous and they're wonderful. And she portrays this sort of humorous take on what was the reality. I grew up, my parents bought one of those kind of homes, and the trees in front were like there were sticks out front with a leaf on it, right? That's what Irma Bombeck described. That's the new suburban world. All right, for young Jewish families in particular now, migrating to the suburbs, however, has a definite impact. It means being uprooted from the familiar warmth of the urban world where they are surrounded by Jewish culture. Much of the world in which they were living, if you think Israel today, there are parallels. So they weren't overtly religious, but they were in a world in which everything was Jewish. And so there's osmosis, there's experiencing of Judaism through almost a sense of osmosis. Wherever you turn, go outside in the streets, there's Yiddish conversations. There's a synagogue everywhere. There are kosher restaurants. There are Jewish neighbors. You didn't need to belong to a synagogue to know, or even have a calendar to know it's Shabbat, or to know that it's Yom Kippur, or to know that it's Passover, because it floated in the air. It just was. But my first job it was in Rockland County in New York, and it's a home of Muncie. You knew when Passover was happening. You knew when Sukkot was happening. All you had to do is walk out your door. All right. So what happens in this new world, though? So they leave all of that. They move to the suburban neighborhoods, and what happens, and this is a whole sociological phenomena, the role of the synagogue in American lives becomes heightened, becomes prominent. In these new suburbs, there's no traditions in place. Young families are faced with this challenge of reinventing what Jewish life means. They want to live side by side with their non-Jewish neighbors. This is a new opportunity, but they still want to maintain connections to Jewish life. We take that for granted. They didn't. In the suburbs, suddenly they're not the majority anymore. And in that model, whether one is a Polish Jew, whether one is a Russian Jew, a Lithuanian Jew, or wherever you came from, simply no longer mattered. Whereas in the urban settings, people gather together by their previous communities. There's still a tendency on some level, for that kind of identification to happen, within our synagogue, we have Israeli communities, right? We have Latin communities, and you see this sense of gathering because there's an identification with, there's a comfort with. It's a natural instinct, right? Well, that's what they left. And once they moved into the suburbs, none of those distinctions really mattered anymore. All right, you've got a whole new way of understanding within homes. Fewer and fewer details of Jewish life and ritual are being seen. At the same time, you're seeing a higher level of synagogue affiliation than ever before. There's an intensely Jewish social experience that's happening, and it furthers Jewish loyalty to identity, while it may not necessarily have impacted religiosity. All right. So in short, joining a synagogue was the way that has suddenly become a way to find one's Judaism. Reform and conservative synagogues flourish. People flock to them not only to fulfill religious needs, but to provide for their social needs. And suburban Jews quickly established other local institutions such as B'nai B'rith and Hadassah and scout trips. Probably none was more symbolic and more important than the establishment of religious schools. Every synagogue had a religious school suddenly. Parents were hoping to instill Jewish values and tradition among their children as they were becoming assimilated into American life. I read an article years ago where it basically said in the early 1900s, the parents would say, I'll take care of my Jewish education. I'll take care of my kids' Jewish education. I need somebody to make sure they get Americanized. By the 1960s, it had reversed. Right? It had reversed. At no time had there ever been such a structured Jewish education experience, totally structured. In some communities, the percentage of kids going was 80%. The very magnitude of those numbers indicates that American Jews were still very clearly voicing their choice to live as Jews and to bring their children up as Jews. There's still plenty, they had to overcome new challenges by living in the suburbs. Just think of the following: the month of December, which we kind of take for granted. There's another holiday that happens in December. There's Christmas, all right? And it pervaded the world in which they were living. And so as a result, what happens is this minor little festival that we have of Hanukkah, which is really about a war, okay? All right, now becomes celebrated. I think my great-grandparents, who I was fortunate enough to know, would have a heart attack if they saw how we celebrated Hanukkah today. For them, it was, that's not a big deal. There are other important holidays. The role of federation also grew and evolved as they assumed a new responsibility, and that is, in a sense, becoming the address of the local community. Where, in a sense, the lay leadership is running things and symbolizing the separation of church and state in America. Federations became more than just a fundraising organization, which is what they had been. They become major policy setting umbrellas, and other community groups join with them. And they spread. It's no longer limited to just the large urban communities. They're all over. And they're ultimately become loosely connected through a national organization as well. So you've got these federations growing during this time. The perception of the Jewish people in general, they now view Gentiles for the first time as friends and colleagues, people to become involved in communal activities such as public schools, firehouses, community centers. They joined the non-Jewish Americans, charities and organizations like the Red Cross, the United Way, PTA. Jews are rubbing elbows with Gentiles as friends, not as neighbors in conflict, which had been the prior experience in the cities. They raise their children to see Gentile classmates not as kids to fight with on the street, but as friends, people to be involved with in band and ballet and Little League. And this process of assimilation really ends up being the greatest challenge to American Jewry in the 20th century. I'll stop for just a second in here and take some comments, some thoughts, some experiences. Yeah, Linda.
So I apologize, but I did not grow up in New York. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, and I grew up in the 50s. Went to school in the 50s and early 60s. And where I grew up, the migration to the suburbs, most of everybody that my parents knew still lived in the city. Some had started moving out to the suburbs. But I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Jewish. Mm-hmm. And my grammar school, my high school were probably anywhere from 90% or more Jewish. There were Catholics who lived in the neighborhood, but the Catholic kids all went to Catholic school, so I didn't know them. The building I lived in, all 6 apartments were Jewish. And I can remember as a young child, 7, 8 years old, I can remember looking out the living room window. We lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. I can remember looking out the window and looking at all the other buildings around and thinking, you know, my thoughts were that the whole world was Jewish, that we were the predominant religion or people, because that's all I knew. I only grew up with and knew Jewish people. It wasn't probably until I was, yes, there were a couple of kids in my grammar school and high school, but it wasn't until I was practically an adult before I realized that this was not the case.
Yeah.
And that's my growing up experience.
Very nice. Judith?
Mine was just the opposite, because I was born and raised in Dallas. My father was born in Dallas. My mother was born in New York, but we used to say we wouldn't hold it against her because she was brought here when she was 2 years old. Mm-hmm. But my experience, I guess, was sort of split. My parents both came from Orthodox families, you know. Mm-hmm. My grandparents came from Europe and so forth. And so at home, it was, you know, Jewish. You know, we lit candles every Shabbat, and we went to Hebrew school, even though we were 3 daughters and the youngest a son. We had bat mitzvahs, confirmations. The thing that was most important in my teenage years was Jewish youth groups. I was real active in USY, my friends in BBYO. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a, now that I look back on it, I didn't think of it at the time, but a really, how do I say, divided kind of life as a child.
Yeah, bifurcated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our bat mitzvah parties, you know, Saturday night, we had all our school friends, majority of which were not Jewish. And some of them came to the bat mitzvah or the bar mitzvah on Saturday morning. But I knew from that age, even though I went study with a non-Jewish boy that year, I was not to date anyone not Jewish.
I'm going to stop here. So I know there's lots of people want to talk. I'll open up the floor as we go along. But I think in a sense, what you heard in a sense was 2 different perspectives. You heard the urban experience. You heard the suburban experience. Very, very well laid out for us, exactly as I described. I promise everybody will get a chance to speak. I'm going to go on, but you heard in a sense those 2 contrasts, which is what I wanted to get out on the table. The 1950s were a period of religious revival in America. In 1954, Congress added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and made in the phrase "in God we trust," which had been found on the coin since the Civil War, now became the national motto. was a generalized return to war. Never before had religion been so institutionalized, so conspicuous in a public setting. Never had church going, in a sense, been so acceptable, so much in the thing to do. People just did. There was a return to religiosity. And Judaism plays a prominent part in that conspicuous new time religion. The religion of American Jews gained widespread American recognition and became, in a sense, the third faith standing besides Catholicism and Protestantism. I mean, I think it's the way many of us thought for a long time. There's three faiths in America, right? Popular interest in Judaism burgeons all over America as people seek to learn about this unknown religion of our time. What happens is fueled by what turns out to be, remember last week we talked about the anticipated poverty following a war. It actually turns into post-war prosperity. And as a result, Judaism strengthens institutionally through the building of synagogues and religious schools, the development of new community institutions, as we've talked about. Although whether or not Jews were becoming more religious or whether they were just affiliating, that's a debate that one could have and just ongoing forever. Whatever the case, religion becomes the vehicle for Jewish identity, while secular Judaism seems to be collapsing. A particular opportunity arose with suburbanization. It's an opportunity, it's a challenge. Some would say it's a terrible thing. You get to come up with your own adjective. In that houses of worship could now draw on congregants from miles away. For Reform Jews, there was no issue. Halakha, ritual, is not an obligation, and therefore driving on Shabbat or holidays was not an obstacle. This was a boon. Orthodox Jews would only drive in the case of emergencies. They built communities around synagogues. I know when my parents bought their home in New Jersey, a criteria is it couldn't be more than, I think we were about 1.25 miles. That was the furthest they were going to be from the synagogue, so that we could walk I walked all the time. My parents walked on certain occasions. All right. It was a criteria. It was an expectation. When I got my first job in a synagogue as a cantor in a conservative synagogue in Rockland County, they made it clear to me if I wanted a job, I would not be driving on Shabbat. They wouldn't hire me unless I made that commitment. Conservative Judaism found itself in this difficult place of how to approach. They claim to be a halakhic organization, a halakhic movement. We follow Jewish law, and yet we have this problem of people not being able to get to synagogue. And so in 1948, they made a strategic decision which is a major departure from tradition, and that is that it permitted Jews not to drive on Shabbat in general, but to drive to shul specifically. And the initial statement was, if you weren't capable of davening on your own. So somebody like me would not have been allowed to drive on Shabbat. So I can do it on my own. All right. This, as a result, in a sense, where the conservative movement and the Orthodox movements before this had been relatively aligned and much closer, this moved the conservative movement much closer to the Reform movement. And as a result, there's an increasing solidarity that gets built in the Orthodox world in response. Reform Judaism also shifts the way in which they start to think, and it becomes they're a new theology in a sense, and a new focus. And that focus of Reform Judaism is not traditional, but it became the focus of Reform Judaism, and that is Tikkun Olam. That is social action. That is not a traditional focus. That is a modern American focus. All right. For the conservative movement, once they opened their doors and allowed people to drive, many people wanted something of a more traditional world. They wanted the touches of the traditional world while being able to get to shul and drive. And so conservative movement grew faster than anybody else. It became the largest movement in America. It was sitting on the cusp of needs on both sides. Now, what I've described for you is a centralization, that the synagogue became the center place. And that's accompanied in many ways by concerned voices. They're warning that the synagogue as a place was a danger in the sense that there was a fear it would take the place of the home as the locus of Jewish learning and Jewish living, and that was not a formula that could succeed. Religious leaders warned about treating Judaism as a leisure activity and instead of an obligation. And this, it's funny. I will share with you that when I started running teaching Judaism in the 1980s, my approach to parents was to say to them, look, this is not an after school activity. This is school. If you wouldn't make that decision about keeping your kid home from school, don't make that decision about keeping your kid home from religious school. If you wouldn't take them out for sports from public school, don't take them out from sports from religious school. And parents bought it. Now, although I still feel the same way, I wouldn't say something like that publicly. It would get me, I'd be tarred and feathered. All right. I have sports. I have sports. I have dancing. I have swimming, and I have religious school. And those are the parallels. It's no longer a parallel to school. That's the shift that has occurred. So again, what we're seeing is some things growing and some things you're seeing ups and downs in this period of time. It's like any other kind of growth. You see those kinds of developmental issues. We see a rise in Jewish theological interest during this time. And so Jewish thought becomes a central concern for many, and particularly for small groups in particular. So you see the existential mood is evidenced by the popularity of such writers as Buber and Rosenzweig and Heschel, and even a renewed interest in Hasidism. Right? Suddenly, theology has become an important issue. On campuses, what you're seeing is radical Jewish students seeking new views of God and world and self and personal new experiences of what it means to be a Jew. And there's a wonderful nature to all of this, but there's also the challenge of becoming a fractured Judaism with it. Prior to World War II, there were very few Judaic studies programs on American colleges. Right? Didn't exist. Students interested in a post-secondary study of Jews and Judaism would have to either matriculate at a seminary or a handful of private colleges that offer courses in Jewish subjects. All this begins to change after World War II. Courses on anti-Semitism, courses on the Holocaust, courses on Hebrew begin to thrive, and it reflects a growing interest in Jewish studies. In the late 1960s, the numbers of colleges and universities began to establish programs dedicated to, mind you, and this is key, the academic study of Jews and Judaism. I can tell you, for example, if you take a Jewish studies program on a university, if you take a Jewish studies program like I'm going through right now at Spertus, it is very different than taking courses at the seminary. The seminary assumes Judaism and teaches text and how to think. Academics on college universities teach about Jews and about Judaism. It's very different. My courses, I'm loving my courses right now, but it is very different than the nature of the courses I took at the seminary. It's not good or bad, it's just very different. These even ended up in DePaul University, a Catholic institution in Chicago, announced plans in 1968 to open a Department of Jewish Studies. It became the thing to do. And 2 years later, in 1970, all of New York's campuses, you have the City College, you have Queens College, you have Brooklyn College, all of them began to offer Jewish studies. So again, we'll stop and let two or so people speak if there are some comments. Yes, Michelle.
Yeah, so just as a comment on that, we have been taking some courses, some webinars offered by the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania on things like Talmud and Mishnah, not from a religious perspective, from a historical, sociological perspective. And I can tell you that A, it's very enlightening, and B, it explains a lot of things that you don't get. It gives you a better understanding than you get from a purely religious orientation. For example, the fact that the Talmud was oral was a reflection of the fact that the Sasanian Empire, Persian Empire, Babylon, was an oral culture.
Yeah. Right. So what they do, and I'm having this, by the way, Martin, the same experience at Spertus, they're giving you the one historical context and the societal context. What else is going on around? That's not what the seminaries do. That's not their intent. It's not good or bad. Michelle, you were next, and then Leslie, and then we're going to go on, and I'll open the floor as we go.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on what we were talking about before about the difference between urban Jews and suburban Jews. I was born in the mid-50s, grew up in Brooklyn. So obviously I was an urban Jew surrounded by Jews. I just knew I was Jewish. My parents belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. And as Mark knows, my dad was the president of the congregation. However, being a girl, I didn't go to Hebrew school, which I resented. Grew up, got married to a man who was raised similarly. We had one child in New York, and then in the late 70s moved to Dallas. That was a huge change for me, because a welcome change, but a huge change, because you couldn't remain Jewish by just walking outside. So you needed to affiliate. If you wanted your children to be Jewish, you needed to affiliate, and you needed to take it seriously, which we did. We had 2 more kids, and that was one of the, they went to public school, but then there was Hebrew school, and Mark was there, the leader of the head of the religious school. They all got good Jewish educations. One of them went on to get a degree at the seminary, but they learned what it was to be Jewish. They learned how to be Jewish. I would walk into a synagogue and just couldn't wait to get out because I didn't know what was going on. I did start studying in the 90s. Mark was one of my teachers. And my children now in their 3 different cities are living very Jewish lives. They're connected. They're not all living the same kind of Jewish life, but they are all quite Jewish, and hopefully their children will be, because they are being educated. So I see the difference between needing the community here and growing up in New York, where you were just Jewish and that was that.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of if you look at Michelle's children, she's got one Reformed Jews in Austin, and she also has her son and daughter and daughter-in-law in Colorado who are Orthodox. And the issue is, will the grandchild wear a black hat or not? Right.
Well, and I have to, since you mentioned my daughter-in-law in Denver, I have to tell a story going back to the very first things you were saying. My son met her while he was working for Masorti after his undergrad school in London. She was a grad student from Louisiana. She was raised Southern Baptist, but had pretty much given up on Jesus. Met my son, and he said to her, look, if I will only marry a Jewish person. And she said, I gave up my parents' religion. I'm not about to take on someone else's just because you want me to. And then she said to him, do you have any books? So he handed her Cholishkin's Jewish Literacy, and the rest is history. Yeah. They came back to Dallas after their year. She was in grad school, and she immediately enrolled in a conversion class. Shortly after she started, I was in the car alone with her, and she said, Michelle, I figured out the basic difference between Judaism and Christianity. And I'm thinking, uh-oh. And she said, well, for Christians, it really doesn't matter how you live as long as you accept Christ. You're okay. for Jews, it doesn't even matter that much if you believe in God, as long as you behave properly. If you act according to God's commandments, you don't have to believe in God, but that's what you need to do. It's action-based rather than faith-based. And that sums it up.
All right, thank you. Leslie, one more, and then we're going to go on. And I'm going to ask people to going forward, let's be a little brief because I have a lot of material yet to go. You need to but you do need to unmute. Yeah.
I grew up in the Air Force, born in New York, a good portion of my early years in Fort Worth. And we were at shul every single day. Hebrew school, Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday school. And it wasn't until I saw on a yontif these old men on the bima with their talesim, blessing the congregation, and turning to my mom and asking, Mommy, what's going to happen to Judaism when all these old men die? Mm-hmm. And then was always in public school, but always went to Hebrew school. Then when I went to college, Hillel became my social and my religious shul. And taking classes at Hillel was very wonderful. So it was a difference of Air Force, you're in a Gentile community. But in high school, Wednesday night, the Air Force chaplain would come and I would go with my mom for a little service there, but that would not have been available without that.
So you've got a range. Clearly what we're hearing, I need to go on, and I apologize. I know there's lots of stories, all right? We're hearing a range which represents something that is different from before this period. One of the next steps in this process, I'm gonna go on now, I apologize, but trying to get through some of the material. After World War II, Orthodox Jewish refugees who come to America arrive with a commitment to orthodoxy that had not necessarily been seen here in America before. They came because Europe had been destroyed, and they brought with them a mindset of cultural superiority, that the Jewish culture was transcendent over American culture. If you realize that in Europe prior to World War II, it was discouraged for serious Jews, those who were scholars, to leave and go to that state of assimilation, America. I imagine most of you have seen The Frisco Kid and the opening scene where they send the Schmendrick. Who's going to America? The Schmendrick. Because the rest of them don't want to go. That's not a place for a serious Jew. With World War II, that changes. And so even the Orthodox world is now shifting. The immigrants who had come earlier were more committed to a balancing act. And so the result is, with this new population, there's a new vitality to Orthodoxy that begins to make an impact on the larger American Jewish community. One of the major goals of this new population was to create a separate Jewish educational system, which really had been a minority thought in the Orthodox Jews of America beforehand. There's a need for intensive Jewish education that comes about. And if you know about Lakewood, New Jersey, and Rabbi Aaron Kotler, all right, he takes his whole population from New York and he moves them down to a secluded small area in New Jersey, and basically says, let's not interact. We're not Hasidim. By the way, this is the Mitnagdim in a sense. This is not Hasidim. This is the other element of Orthodoxy, just as Frum, in many ways, maybe more so. Okay, but they create a community that is meant to be isolated. And this begins to spread all over the country. You see that kind of learning going on, although the graduates of those programs are out teaching all over. You know, here we have Rabbi Wolbe. What's his program? Torch. In Dallas, they had another program. It was a parallel, right? You see the tentacles of that program from Lakewood and that world reaching out in different ways. This is going on, well, at the same time, this is where there's fracturing. The assimilation in the 1950s sees the beginning of a skyrocketing of a new phenomenon called intermarriage. In 1950, the rate of Jewish intermarriage was 6%. By the end of the century, it was 50%. Right? That's an incredible change in a community. It creates a new trend of assimilation. Jews maintain their names and their cultural identities, but they're willingly abandoning much of Jewish life. All right. And mind you, this is in a world in which it's not that long ago that people gave up their lives to maintain their Jewish distinctions. Now in America, there's a willingness to step away. And it makes the concept of determining identity and Jewish continuity very challenging. And I think the major issue we have in America right now, there's lots of issues. Let me not say the major, let me say a major issue we have in America is how do we deal with this intermarriage issue? All right. I know I'm going to tell you point blank, my grandfather divorced my grandmother, married a non-Jew. I never met him. He was declared dead. The family, he was not part of the family. He was gone. By the time my sister married somebody not Jewish, that behavior doesn't exist. All right, it's a different world. There are advantages to outreach. There are disadvantages to outreach. I will tell you one. The reform movement's been very good at the outreach concept. One of the challenges they have, though, there's two issues that have arisen in their openness. Okay, one is you hear described by couples who do get in married. They marry another Jew as feeling as outsiders. Okay, they don't belong. They're the strange ones. And the second thing is the level of Jewish education. The result is you're constantly in a mode of teaching basic, because that's what everybody needs. There's no time to teach anything beyond Judaism 01. You hear a lot of Reform rabbis complaining privately that they're frustrated by that. All right, Judith.
That brings up what I was going to say before and ask. Again, my parents came from Orthodox families, but we joined a conservative synagogue, mainly so, starting with me and my older sister would have Hebrew school. Mm-hmm. And we could drive on Shabbat and so forth. But they also encouraged us. They sent us to Camp Ramah, which was expensive. The only one back then was in California, all but my older sister, who is not as religiously active as me, my younger sister, and my brother, who went to Ramah. Like I said, USY for me and my younger sister was big.
Judith, I apologize. I'm going to ask you to try and keep it to 1 minute because otherwise we're not going to get anybody else a chance to speak.
This is my point. The studies have shown that, at least back then, those young people who were involved in those kinds of activities, especially Ramah and things, ended up being more likely to marry somebody Jewish, more likely, to raise their children as Jews and so forth. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the home.
It's reality, it's the home, it's day schools, it's Ramah, it is Israel trips. Those seem to be the predictors of, that doesn't mean other factors don't play and there aren't successes. But if you were to sit down and say, what are my greatest odds? Those would probably be the ones I would say to you are most predictive of the outcomes you can get. All right. I'm going to go on. All right. So now I want to turn to American responses to events in Israel. Okay. The struggles in Israel in the 60s are mirrored in the political activities of American Jews in a way not seen before. American Jews are identifying with Israel even when they're deeply critical of the policies of the state. In the spring of '67, in the Six-Day War, it lends that era a lot of character, of distinctive character, and it's a turning point in the way Jews understood themselves. Before, there was a paralyzing fear of a second Holocaust, followed by what turns into Israel's seemingly miraculous victory over the combined Arab forces that set out to destroy them. And it strikes deep emotional chords among American Jews. In May, before the war itself, you were hearing rumblings from all the Arab capitals, putting Israel's supporters in America on edge. We knew what the potential was. Tensions had been high for several months. There were gatherings on the Syrian border with incessant shellings being sent on Israel and its kibbutzim and its towns. On May 14th, this crisis spreads as large number of Egyptian troops mass in the Sinai Peninsula, followed 2 days later by a Cairo radio broadcast which declared the following: the existence of Israel has continued too long. We welcome the Israeli aggression. We welcome the battle that we have long awaited. The great hour has come. The battle has come in which we shall destroy Israel. And to do so, Egypt closes off the Straits of Tiran, where the ships can get in and out to Israel. The United Nations, recognizing what's going on, withdraws its forces, which had patrolled it, and France and Great Britain step away from their commitment of guaranteeing the 1957 agreement of free passage through this. May 30th, the King Hussein of Jordan pledges to put his troops in the command of the Egyptian army. Forces from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Kuwait, and Egypt begin to gather in Jordan on the eastern border. So now you've got north, you've got east, you've got west. June 30th, Radio Cairo declares to its listeners in the Arab world that the holy war through which we will restore the rights of the Arabs, which has been stolen from us by Palestine, and we will reconquer the plundered soil of Palestine. That's the message that's going out. 2 days later, on the 5th, the Israeli Air Force attacks the airfields of Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, and a war fought on land, air, and sea has begun in earnest, and it took a whopping 6 days. I mean, at this point, we all know from the Six-Day War. For Israel, considered to be weak, numerically inferior, standing alone in the world, and it brings about a dramatic and lopsided victory. It conquers vast territories, it defeats mighty armies, it reunites Jerusalem, the sacred center of Jewish history. American Jews, because that's really what we're looking at, even those who had previously expressed only a passing interest in Israel, rally to support the beleaguered state. The UJA, which at the time was the premier fundraising arm of American Jewry, raised $100 million in that month to send to Israel. College students held mass meetings on their campuses. Now, mind you, this is at a time in which they're all protesting the war in Vietnam, and nonetheless, they see Israel as a different and just war. Thousands sign up to go to Israel to aid in the war effort. Teenagers are standing on street corners collecting money. Government officials find themselves inundated with delegations, with letters, with telegrams urging American support. 6 years later, the Yom Kippur War provokes a similar American reaction. Once again, Israel is threatened. In this case, it drags on longer. It's not a 6-day war. Israel is caught by surprise. And in the beginning, it's more shocking. But the ending brings the same sense of euphoria, the same sense of pride American Jews had shared in that fear, in that doom. And they reacted in the moment. They send money, this time $107 million in the first week of the war, and $675 million altogether. They rally petition to those in power. About 30,000 American Jews volunteer to go to Israel and participate directly in the war. you've got a roller coaster of emotions going on here. You've got a fear of destruction. You've got a jubilation after war, but there's also with it the threat of yet another. It's always on the horizon. And so it's left its mark on American Jews and their cultural practices. Much of the tenor of American Jewry changed after the 1967 war and the emergence of the popular image of now Jews fight. Jews stand up for themselves. This is a new image. Again, it stands in contrast, whether or not it's accurate of all Jews in the Holocaust, the perception was they went to their death like lambs. This is a new image. And so you have institutions and organizations that previously had paid not so much attention to Israel. Suddenly, Israel has become a source of attention. And I remember this. Hebrew schools, Jewish community centers, Jewish social services decorate their walls with posters of Israel's landscape, Israel's people, Israel. There are posters everywhere. I remember one day walking into Hebrew school and it's like, there's just posters everywhere that hadn't been there before. Except for the oldest and the most traditional among them, most American Jews switched their Hebrew. I was in third grade and I learned Ashkenazic Hebrew in 1960, as third grade was, I was 1966. By 1967, suddenly it had become Sephardic Hebrew. My mom swore when she'd hear me daven years later that I kept slipping back and forth. I don't think so, but it's possible. All right. I started out Ashkenazic Hebrew, and in 1967, it changed. You saw this impact all over the place. Hebrew names started to rise in popularity. In 1967, observant Jewish men who had been afraid to wear a kippot in public suddenly are donning kippot in public ways, and it's a change in thought, because before that, the motto was essentially be a man on the streets and a Jew in your home. And the era of 1967 ushers in is the opportunity to be a Jew anywhere. Jewish institutions find their way to work Israel into their formal programming. Anybody who's been to Ramah knows we have shlichim. We go and bring in, I speak in the we, I spent 16 years at Ramah. Ramah goes and brings in people from Israel to serve as counselors, so that there's an interaction between both, not just the kids, but the counselors themselves, the teenagers who are working and the young 20s who are working. They are exposed to Israeli culture and vice versa. Synagogues, federations, Jewish clubs are organizing trips to Israel, often referred to as a mission. That's not an accent. What does a mission do? It converts somebody. All right, and you've got every possible constituency being addressed. 1999, you've got Bronfman and Steinhardt organizing Birthright. Every young American Jew, they declare, has a basic need to learn about Israel, and therefore a basic right to receive a free trip to the only place where they can see Judaism thrive as an integral part of Israel, of everyday life. It is. It's returning to the New York or the Chicago, as you described, Linda. That where Judaism just is. It just is. The other element of this time was Soviet Jewry. The impact of what's going on in Israel not only affects us here in America, it affects Jews in the Soviet Union. They become a heightened sense of awareness that they're really suffering injustices that they're at the hands of their own government. Anti-Semitism in this time becomes the unofficial doctrine of state, and discrimination of Jews and Judaism is an accepted fact. After the 1967 war and the liberalization tide in Eastern Europe, Soviet policy becomes even more restrictive towards Jews. The Jews are denied educational opportunities, they're denied vocational opportunities. And at the same time, the Jews in that country are now experiencing an awakening where they challenge the government's ban on religious and Hebrew training. Many react to their harsh lives by publicly demonstrating a strong stand with the state of Israel and demanding free emigration. Many of them become what we know as the refuseniks. Suddenly, Soviet Jews have begun to write letters to Soviet leaders and to the outside world, demanding the right to leave and identifying themselves with the state of Israel. Israel has become a source of pride through their victory in 1967. As Russian Jews begin to organize, American Jews have a parallel experience towards the Russian Jews. Sensitized, mind you, to what was often perceived as a failing during the Holocaust to take action, okay, schooled by the political activism of the 1960s, and exploiting Cold War politics, American Jews made the cause of Russian Jews their own. You may remember people setting aside a matzah of hope on this Passover Seder table for the Soviet Jews. You may remember the twinning and the bar mitzvah twinning program. I certainly grew up with that, right? You know, there's a Soviet Jewish child who cannot have a bar mitzvah. And so they gave you a name, you put up a poster with this picture, you studied about his life. If you were lucky, you were able to communicate. In some way, you built a bridge with those who could not have the experience you were going through. Other people picketed, they demonstrated, they promoted legislation to punish the Soviet Union for its misdeeds. And in April 1966, senators issued a statement asking that the 3 million Jews of the Soviet Union be allowed to live creatively and in dignity as Jews. Let my people go became a clarion call. And that with that, the Soviet Union responds with, and they respond with imprisonments, with arrests, all right? And so what you've got is a lot of refuseniks being very publicly aware, and there's advocacy going on throughout America. They use strategies using public relations, political actions, education, and it had become essentially a crusade. American Jews were traveling, and still do in many ways, to the Soviet Union surreptitiously to bring Jewish life to them in one way. You have organizations, the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, all playing out. There's only a couple of readings today. Gail, you've got reading number 1 by Anatoly or Natan Sharansky.
In 1973, Anatoly Sharansky was denied an exit visa by the Soviet Union and subsequently became one of the best known Soviet Jewish refuseniks. He was arrested on charges of spying for the United States in March of 1977, and the following year was convicted and sentenced to 13 years of hard labor. The New York-based Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry focused on bringing international pressure against the Soviet Union in its efforts to gain the release of Sharansky, who would later adopt the name Natan after emigrating to Israel.
Okay, now, yes, Joyce.
No, I was just going to tell you one thing about not about Sharansky, about the student struggle and the organization that I became very much involved with, which was the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. Mm-hmm. When these organizations became more active, Leonid Brezhnev was the president or the whatever of the Soviet Union, and Brezhnev was asked whether he wasn't concerned about the uprising in America of Jews, and Brezhnev said, "Oh, who cares about those? They're just students and housewives." Mm-hmm. And so whenever I give a talk on Soviet Jewry, I always say, look at what students and housewives can do.
Yeah, I will tell you, my very first thing I ever did with fundraising was, it's kind of cute. I think back to this little 13-year-old little boy standing out in a synagogue parking lot during carpool with a can. I raised $6.83, and my rabbi sent it in, and I got a thank you letter from the student struggle. $6. I was so proud. I raised $6.83. I still have the letter. All right, there's lots I could say on this. I do want to open up the floor at this point. If there are comments on any Israel, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Jews, etc., and American, primarily about American responses to those moments. Yes.
Well, in Houston, we had a chapter of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. It was called Houston Action for Soviet Jews. And Judy Goldman, who some of you may remember, and I led it for until the wall came down, until Gorbachev became, president. And we did all of those things. We went to the Soviet Union and we took in stuff that we shouldn't have taken in, and we met with refuseniks, and we took their histories back, and I used to call people every day in the Soviet Union to get information, and we twinned, and we met with all of the politicians that we could meet with, and we did all of those things, and the community was wonderfully involved in it, and we had a great relationship with the Federation. We were not part of the Federation, but we had a good symbiotic relationship with them. So it was a wonderful thing to do, and it was a wonderful period in my life. It's something that I'm very proud of.
That's lovely. Yes, Phyllis, you haven't spoken yet. Yeah, and then Sandy.
Yeah, I had the experience on the home front in Houston working with the people who were lucky enough to leave the Soviet Union. I was hired by the Federation, I guess it was 76, 77, 78, somewhere around there, to teach English to those who came here. I had a lot of, at the time I knew Russian, and I had a lot of experience with ESL teaching. And I agree with Joyce, it was one of the things in my career that I'm most proud of, and that was the most meaningful to me, was to get these people fresh off the boat who were amazed to go into a grocery store. It was an eye-opener for them. And befriend and teach and acculturate them. And it was very, very rewarding. And I'm thrilled to have participated.
Yeah, we are built with this great little gift, and then Sandy, you're next. We're built with this great little gift that God built into us. When we do something like that, we feel good. There's an intrinsic reward that's built into us. Thank you, God. Sandy.
Yeah, just going back to the 67 war, I don't know if you remember, there was a very popular poster that showed this Hasidic Jew, with his curls. He's wearing a Superman suit with the shin on it, or sin on it, instead of the S. But that became a very popular symbol that, okay, we were not just a bunch of weak lawyers and accountants, with people out there who could whoop the butts of the Soviet-sponsored Arab community. Yeah. Then shifting to Soviet Jewry, I think my sense was a groundswell of people, primarily whose families came from Eastern Europe, who had this very strong identity, and the Joyce Gilberts and other people who were great leaders of the community in doing that. I don't know where Vanek was from, what state Vanek was from, but Jackson's from the state of Washington, which did not have a big Jewish population. So these are not, I don't think these are New York congressmen who felt the need to step up because they felt strongly about it. But right. Anyone who believes that the Soviet Jews would have been allowed to emigrate without the Joyce Gilberts of the world is fooling themselves.
That's lovely. Thank you. So there's plenty more we could talk about. I encourage you, look, like any good education process, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So I encourage you to go out and get more books and read. And hopefully what I'm doing is provoking you to do that. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at there you go. Life is a Bowl of Cherries by Irma Bombeck. There you go. What am I doing in the pits? I remember that. I read that book. Or something about a septic tank. There was another one like that too. Yeah. So the next couple of weeks, we'll take some particular topics. Next week, we'll deal with the Holocaust as it relates to America. The following week, we'll deal with Israel in a larger picture. We'll spend the whole time on that. And the last week, we'll take a little bit of a look at Texas Jewish history. I am not an expert on Texas Jewish history. I'm sure there are people here who have much better stories, etc. That'll be an opportunity really to share and to teach me as well. All right, everybody stay warm. Be glad you don't have to go out with your shovels and enjoy the day.
Not yet.
Thank you for a great class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cantor.
Thank
the-
you all.
Thank you all.
Cantor, the book is The Grass is
Grass
Always
is always
Greener Over
greener.
the Septic
Over
Tank.
the septic
That's
tank.
right.
That's right.
Wonderful books.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right,
Take
thank you all.
care.
Thank
Shalom,
you.
shalom.
Bye-bye.
Somebody was saying something and yeah,
Okay,
okay,
leave, please.
all right.